Hey everyone, it's Dr. Marcon. This is the second video in our cardiovascular physiology lecture series. First, we're going to talk a little bit about the electrocardiogram. We kind of went over this in lab. We know that the electrocardiogram provides an electrical view of the heart. There are different ways to describe an electrocardiogram. We can say ECG or EKG. EKG, again, being sort of the European variant because they spell cardio with a K. Also, important to note that we say EKG because sometimes clinically, ECG sounds a lot like EEG, and EEG is an electroencephalogram, basically providing a graphic representation of the waves within the brain. And we didn't want ECG to be confused with EEG, so some clinicians will say EKG instead, sticking with the European variant. Anyways, so electrocardiogram is a way to show a graphic representation of the electrical conductivity within the heart, or the electrical activity in the heart. It's non-invasive. It involves putting on a series of leads on the patient, on their chest, as well as on their limbs. So it measures the summed electrical activity of all cardiac cells and basically showing volume conductance. Volume conductance is the electrical activity passed through the blood via the electrolytes. Now we know that EKGs are very diagnostic. It helps us it can show the heart rate of a patient as well as showing previous myocardial infarctions or previous heart attacks. It can also show different conduction abnormalities such as bundle branch blockage, as well as showing us the size of the different heart chambers and the location of the heart. So an ECG or EKG consists of a series of waves, segments, and intervals. A wave is a deflection above or below a baseline. So we have different waves. We have the P wave, we have the T wave. Segments are the baseline between waves. So segments, for example, we have the ST segment right here. This segment at the baseline. And an interval is a combination of waves and segments. We talked about, for example, the QT interval, showing us the systolic time, or the time that the heart is within systole, and then the TQ time, in which we show the heart when it is in diastole or in a period of filling. The ECG activity corresponds to electrical events of the cardiac cycle, and we talked about this in lab. So for example, P wave represents atrial depolarization. So depolarization is just a fancy term for contraction. So the P wave is when the atria, both right and left, are contracting and pushing blood, increasing pressure to push blood so that it can enter the ventricles. The QRS complex, this corresponds to two events, actually. We know that it corresponds to ventricular depolarization, so when the ventricles are contracting. But at the same time, while the ventricles are contracting, we know that the atria are relaxing or undergoing a period of repolarization. So QRS complex representing two events, ventricular depolarization or ventricular contraction, and atrial repolarization or atrial filling, atrial relaxation. The next event is the T wave. So the T wave representing ventricular repolarization or ventricular relaxation, ventricular filling. We know that an EKG estimates the duration of systole and diastole with our different intervals. So the heart, a normal resting heart, will be 1/3 of the time will be undergoing ventricular systole or ventricular contraction, and 2/3 of the time it will be undergoing relaxation or ventricular diastole. So the QT interval, 1/3 of the time representing ventricular systole, we can actually see from 100 milliseconds to about 350 milliseconds. This is our QT interval. And then from 350 milliseconds to about 900 milliseconds, this is when this is showing us our TQ interval, or when the ventricles are undergoing diastole. Okay, so we can actually use this to show whether a heart is relaxing or at rest versus, as we saw in lab, a heart that is undergoing exercise, when we have an increase in heart rate and when we can see that there is a reduction in diastole, and showing that the duration, half of the time under exercise conditions, half the time will be in systole and the other half will be in diastole. Again, showing a reduction in the ventricular diastole. So the cardiac cycle explains the stepwise progression the heart goes through when it contracts and relaxes. So we know the heart contracts during systole and relaxes during diastole. So the cardiac cycle can be broken down. We have periods of atrial systole and diastole, as well as ventricular systole and ventricular diastole, and these will overlap. So for example, number one, when the atria and ventricles are both relaxed and filling with blood, right now in number one, they are undergoing both atrial and ventricular diastole. So blood is returning from the veins to the atria and they're filling. From the atria, the blood will passively flow into the ventricles. So both atria and ventricles are undergoing diastole at this point. Number two, when the atria contract, they are undergoing atrial systole or systole. At this point, blood is being pushed actively into the ventricles, and while this is happening, the ventricles are relaxed or undergoing ventricular diastole. So blood is being pushed actively from the atria into the ventricles, and at this point the atrioventricular valves are open, allowing for blood to be pushed from the atria into the ventricles. And then the next part of the cardiac cycle, we undergo ventricular systole. So the ventricles are contracting, and while the ventricles are contracting, the atria are relaxing, again receiving blood either from the veins on the right or from the lungs on the left. So blood is being pushed during ventricular systole. Blood is being pushed from the ventricles into the arteries, so that then they can be pushed towards the vein and back to veins and then back to the atria. So diastole, just a period of relaxation or repolarization. Systole, a period of contraction or depolarization. So that's basically an overview of the cardiac cycle. However, there are 5 phases of the cardiac cycle, and we'll go over each and every phase. So typically the cardiac cycle is described as having 5 phases. The first phase starts here. So this is the first phase of the cardiac cycle. This is late ventricular and atrial diastole. At this point, the pressure in the atria is greater, and as it increases, it increases as it fills with blood. So the pressure in the atria is greater than the pressure in the ventricles. At this point, 2/3 of the blood will passively flow from the atria into the ventricle. The AV valves are open, the semilunar valves are closed, so the ventricles can fill. There is never a situation where all valves will be open. there is a situation where all valves can be closed, but never all valves open. So at this point in the first part of the cardiac cycle, the AV valves are open. At rest, the majority of this cardiac cycle is spent in this first phase. Now, during exercise, the duration of diastole, of course, decreases. We talked about that in lab. And this is due to an increased change in pressure as well as an increased flow of blood. So here we see late diastole, first phase of the cardiac cycle. Again, the pressure in the atria is greater than the pressure in the veins, allowing for blood to actively flow from the atria. The pressure of the ventricles, allowing for the blood to flow from the atria passively into the ventricles. The next phase, or phase 2 of the cardiac cycle, we have atrial systole. So this is when the atria contract. This is also known as the atrial kick. This is where we have blood being actively pushed. So the last third of the blood in the atria are actively being pushed into the ventricles. At this point, the ventricles are still relaxed. The AV valves are still open, and the semilunar valves are still closed. This is an active process. So blood is being pushed actively from the atria into the ventricles. And again, this is the second phase of the cardiac cycle. Now, we can measure end diastolic volume in this phase. End diastolic volume is the volume of blood at the end of diastole. Basically, how much blood is in the ventricles before it is pushed out. We know that 1/3 of the blood is what is being pushed actively, whereas 2/3 undergo a passive flow. So the end diastolic volume being composed of that flow from the passive flow and active flow of blood from the atria into the ventricles. Also, end diastolic volume is composed of remainder blood from the previous cardiac cycle. Now, end diastolic volume, we usually typically measure it at 100 milliliters just for computation purposes, but it's actually closer to 135 milliliters, and this kind of fits that European standard male. For example, Luke Skywalker, young Luke Skywalker in the first Star Wars trilogy, being that European standard, we know that end diastolic volume should be around 135 milliliters, but we are using 100 milliliters to make the math easier. Typical end diastolic volume, we are saying, is 100 milliliters or 100 milliliters per beat. The next phase of the cardiac cycle is isovolumic ventricular systole. I know these are a lot of words, a lot of big words, but we can break it down. So iso means the same, volumic or volume, so same volume. And then ventricular systole, basically when the ventricles are contracting. This means that when the ventricles are contracting, there is no change in volume, okay? So with when the ventricles are starting to contract, they contract and generate pressure. So the ventricles will get smaller, but the volume of blood is the same as the ventricles are squeezed. However, the pressure increases. Once the pressure of the ventricles increase and are greater than the pressure in the atria, this is when we have the atrioventricular valves, or the AV valves, will shut, and they will produce that first heart sound. Now, pressure, particularly in the left ventricle, is still less than the pressure in the aorta. We know typical blood pressure is 120 systole, 80 diastole. So in diastole, the pressure of the aorta aorta is around 80 millimeters per mercury. So at this point, the pressure in the left ventricle is less than the pressure in the aorta. And the semilunar valves are still closed at this point. So we say the outlet pressure, the outlet being the valves on the outlet of the ventricles. These are the semilunar valves. The outlet pressure is still greater than the pressure in the ventricles, so the SL or semilunar valves will remain closed. Okay? So the duration of this phase is a very short period of time, and diastolic volume is still the same, so the volume of blood is still the same. So the purpose of this phase, or this phase of the cardiac cycle, is basically just to generate pressure so that we can reach the next phase of the cardiac cycle, and that phase being ventricular ejection. In phase 4, ventricular ejection, we can see here, blood is ejected from the ventricles into the outlet. So on the right, blood will go to the lungs through the pulmonary semilunar valves. On the left, blood will go from the left ventricle through the aortic semilunar valves to the aorta. The pressure exceeds the outlet pressure, again, the pressure of the valves at the outlet of the ventricles, the semilunar valves, and the pressure forces the semilunar valves to open so that blood can be ejected. About 70 to 80% of blood at this point is ejected. And while blood is being ejected from the ventricles, we know that the atrial ventricular valves are closed, so there's no regurgitation of blood back into the atria. So this phase of the cardiac cycle is what gives the systolic blood pressure. Again, that pressure forcing blood from the ventricles either into the lungs on the right or to the aorta, to the rest of the body on the left. The next phase of the cardiac cycle is phase 5. This is a period of isovolumic ventricular diastole. Now this is the same as systole, but instead of generating pressure, we are actually reducing pressure. Okay, so here we have isovolumic ventricular diastole. At this point, the pressure in the ventricles is less than the pressure in the arteries, and the ventricles will start to relax. So ventricles will start relaxing, the chamber size gets bigger, pressure in the ventricles decrease so that the pressure is less than the outlet pressure. Now that the pressure is less than the outlet pressure, the semilunar valves will shut and produce that second heart sound. We talk about the heart sounds, lub-dub. Dub is that second heart sound produced by the shutting of the semilunar valves in this phase. So the pressure within the ventricles is still greater than the pressure in the atria at this point. So the AV valves are still closed. However, once the pressure within the atria increases above the pressure of the ventricles, that is when the AV valves will start to open and then start a new cardiac cycle. So again, isovolemic ventricular diastole, this is a relaxation of the ventricles. Instead of generating pressure, we are reducing pressure, allowing for filling of the blood within the ventricles. During isovolemic ventricular diastole, we can get our next measurement, which is end systolic volume. End systolic volume is the volume of blood in the ventricle at the end of systole. So at phase 5, there is no change in blood volume. And we can, at this point, with obtaining end-stroke volume, we know that end-stroke volume is highly regulated at approximately 30 milliliters. So we can actually figure out stroke volume using this number. because we know it's highly regulated. Stroke volume is the amount of blood that is pumped by one ventricle during contraction. And the formula for stroke volume is to get the difference between end diastolic volume and end stroke volume. So if we said that end diastolic volume is about 100 milliliters, and we know that the highly regulated number for end systolic volume is 30 milliliters, we can say that stroke volume equals 100 minus 30, which equals 70 milliliters per beat. And 70 milliliters per beat for stroke volume is what we consider normal stroke volume. This is a slide showing you or summarizing the events during the cardiac cycle as the heart contracts and relaxes, starting with phase 1. Phase 1 being atrial and ventricular diastole. Both atria and both ventricles are relaxing and filling at this point, but in the atria, the pressure is greater than the pressure in the ventricles, allowing for blood to flow from a high pressure to a low pressure. The atria are still receiving blood from the vena cava as well as the coronary sinus. However, with a greater pressure than the ventricles, blood is able to flow passively. About 2/3 of the blood is able to passively flow into the ventricles. Now we can see that both atrioventricular valves are open, and in the ventricles, the pressure is less than the outlet pressure, so the semilunar valves remain closed. Okay, so this is phase 1, atrial and ventricular diastole. The next phase being atrial systole. This is when we still have an increased pressure within the atria greater than the pressure in the ventricles. However, blood is being forced or pushed actively from the atria into the ventricles. The last remaining 1/3 of the blood in the atria are actively being pushed into the ventricles. So the atrioventricular valves are open while the systolic or the semilunar valves are still closed. Now, the next phase is an isovolumic ventricular systole. The pressure in the ventricles at this point is greater than the pressure in the atria. Because the pressure in the ventricles is greater than the atrioventricular valves will now close, producing that first heart sound, the lub in the lub-dub. Now, during this phase, blood is trapped in the ventricles, and we're basically generating pressure so that we can get to the next phase in the cardiac cycle. So pressure is being generated. We have the same blood volume within the ventricles. However, the semilunar valves still remain closed. At this point, we can measure end diastolic volume. End diastolic volume is the maximal volume that can occur or that the ventricles can obtain, can have. So the volume of the blood in the ventricle is not changing. That's why it's called isovolumic ventricular systole. This is just to generate pressure so that, again, we can get to the next phase of the cardiac cycle, which is our ventricular ejection. At this point, the pressure in the ventricles has now increased to the point where it is greater than the outlet pressure or the pressure of the semilunar valves, so that blood can be ejected from the ventricles into either the lungs on the right or through the aorta to the rest of the body on the left. So at this point, the AV valves are closed, and then the semilunar valves are opened. The next phase of the cardiac cycle is our isovolumic ventricular diastole, where the ventricles now can relax, Isovolumic, again, meaning that we have the same volume of blood within the ventricles, but instead of generating pressure, we are decreasing pressure, decreasing to the point where, again, we can go to the next phase. So the pressure in the ventricles is decreasing to the point where it will decrease below the pressure of the outlet pressure, or the outlet of the semilunar valves. So the semilunar valves will close and produce that second heart sound, the dub in the lub dub. At this point, we can measure our end systolic volume, or the volume of blood that is remaining after ventricular ejection. And we know, again, this volume is highly regulated. We can say it is approximately 30 milliliters. And from this number, we can then determine our stroke volume being the difference between end diastolic volume and end stroke volume. Okay, so isovolemic ventricular diastole, the AV valves are closed and the semilunar valves are also closed. And blood is just basically trapped in the ventricles until the pressure in the atria increases to the point where it will, again, open the AV valves to start the cardiac cycle again. Okay, so this is the filling and ejection of blood in one heartbeat, and this is known as the cardiac cycle. So the next slide is called Wigger's diagram. Now, you don't have to worry too much about this diagram. Just know that it shows the relationship of, for example, an electrocardiogram. We know electrocardiogram, again, being that graphic representation of the electrical activity of the heart. It shows the EKG through one cardiac cycle, and then one cardiac cycle where the left heart and aortic pressures, as well as the left ventricular volume, is related to the EKG. Okay, so it's just basically showing what happens, the events of the cardiac cycle through the left ventricle with one EKG. That's all you really need to know about that. You don't have to, interpret it too much, but know that this type of diagram exists. The next part of the cardiovascular physiology lectures will then talk about vessels, and that will be another video. But before we go into that, just a reminder, just something for you guys to be aware of. The right and left ventricles do pump the same amount, the same volume of blood, despite the pressure differences needed to pump into the different vessels. We know that it takes less pressure for the right ventricle to push blood to the lungs versus the left ventricle that needs more pressure to pump blood through the aorta to the rest of the body. Despite these pressure differences, the same amount of blood is being pumped by the two ventricles. Okay? All right, so the next video will be on blood vessels.